Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host Jed Lea-Henry, and today I'm talking with Edward Reed. Edward is an adjunct professor at the Asian Institute of Management in Manila, and from 2004 to 2012 he was the Korea Country Representative for the Asia Foundation, as well as being the North Korea Country Director for World Vision International. And from these roles, and many similar to it, Ed has worked in a hands-on capacity both in South Korea and particularly North Korea, analysing, improving, and dealing with the history and the unique challenges of the agricultural sector in particular. And it is this today that we're going to speak about on the podcast. It has often been said in the media that North Korea is improving in terms of its food security situation. And in some ways this is true. Things have certainly gotten better since the famine years in the mid-1990s. But as recently as May this year, the United Nations Food Security Assessment for North Korea found that it had the worst harvest in the last 10 years. Dry spells, heat and flooding were affecting the country, and over 10 million people still suffered from severe food shortages. Meaning in real terms, that people would live in harvest to harvest, and in situations like this is just not enough food to get by. This is a challenging issue. Why, after 25 years, is North Korea still food insecure? Why, despite all the humanitarian aid, all the international help, and all the internal lessons that they could have learnt themselves, are they a country that still seems to be stuck in a cyclical pattern that consistently reverts back to hunger and malnutrition? To understand this, it is important to understand the famine years, how North Korea got themselves into this position in the first place, the unsustainable patterns, the reliance on foreign imports on things such as chemical fertilizer, but more importantly, the poor farming habits that were there on the ground. And by perhaps not understanding this at the time, many aid agencies fell into the gap that was created here. They walked into North Korea with an expectation that it would be just another humanitarian crisis, like all the others they had seen before. But instead they found a centrally planned economy and a centrally controlled state that was still very much intact. It hadn't broken down. It still insisted on controlling the farming sector, the agricultural growth of the society, the economy from Pyongyang, just as it insisted on controlling the aid that was coming into the country and the information and the patterns of behavior that was available to the aid organizations. This was a unique kind of situation. North Korea were begging the world for help, and yet when that help came, they only wanted it under certain conditions and in ways that they could control. It was a restrictive policy environment that simply hadn't been seen before on this level. Aid agencies couldn't assess the problem on the ground. They couldn't get access to raw data, or even often to the personal accounts of the people involved. And whenever a policy could be agreed upon, a strategy for moving North Korea out of famine and food insecurity, that involved something more systemic than simply food aid. It always hinged on the will of the leadership from Pyongyang, and specifically Kim Jong-il. As soon as a policy was designated by him, suddenly it had nationwide acceptance, and people were 100% behind it. Failing this, any prospective policy never really got out of its embryonic phases, which of course is one of the sustaining problems with North Korean aid today and food insecurity. And that is the political conundrum on the ground, and importantly, the sustaining nature of the public distribution system. That is the centralized mechanism by which North Korea distributes food to its people. This removes ordinary incentives for farmers and market competition, and in many ways encourages unsustainable farming practices. The type of practice that seeks milking as much productivity from farmland in the moment, and then suffer the results of the soil degradation further down the line. A cycle of boom and bust in terms of food security in North Korea. But this is not just a picture of North Korean agriculture, not just a picture of the history of the famine or a history of the North Korean farming sector. Ed uses this technological detail and this history to build up a much broader picture of the country itself and answer much more fundamental questions. This is not just an image of the failure of North Korea, but a potential picture for how it can escape these patterns in the future. A structure for improving its food security, and a lesson for international aid agencies who may be engaged or future engaged in North Korea. Now, at times in this podcast, there may be a little bit of background noise, often dogs barking. And this is simply because Ed lives where he works. He lives in a rural part of the Philippines. And as much as possible, I've tried to edit out the larger noises that come through in the background. It's still going to be there to a degree. It's not imposing though, and it certainly doesn't take away from the content of the podcast. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. And if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting it directly at the PayPal link or the Patreon link attached below. Or, and just as importantly, you can share, like, or comment on this podcast across social media. And I especially encourage this if you have any recommendations for future guests. I'm always on the lookout for new people to bring on the podcast, and I will take all the recommendations in the comments section seriously. On that, and to walk us through the history, the failings, and the potential future for North Korean agriculture and food security, this is Edward Reed. Edward Reed, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
So you've done a lot of fascinating research for quite a number of years now on the development of agriculture in a number of different countries. And recently it's focused on not just South Korea, but also North Korea. So I might get you to start with a leading question, because in many people's minds, North Korea was this country that went through the horrible famine in the early 1990s. But of course, they still have a food security crisis today. Many people are aware that North Korea is improving, and I suppose it is in some ways. But you, through your research, have shown that it still hasn't got back to those pre-famine standards that existed before. So I might get you to start by explaining, at least as an overview, the food security crisis that currently exists in North Korea.
Okay, I'll try to do that. I think many people might have been surprised just a few months ago when the Food and Agricultural Organization put out an alert that North Korea had a drop in its harvest, and people were starving again and needed aid, needed food to be shipped in. This I hope it surprised people, because it's been 24 years since the beginning of the famine, and there have been tremendous amounts of aid given to North Korea in various ways, both to supplement its food and also to improve its agriculture. And yet still, here we are in 2019, still asking the world to help poor North Korea, starving people in North Korea. This should not happen. And the question should be, why is it still happening after all of this aid? And this is what sort of the focus of my recent research has been.
So let's build that up then. Take us back to those early famine years, and then we can build our way towards where we are today and why we find ourselves there. What were the famine years? I suppose go back pre-famine as well, and explain just why this great calamity converged from, I suppose, various different directions on North Korea in the early 1990s.
Okay, it's complicated, but let me see if I can do it. The famine years we usually associate with 1995 to maybe 98 or 99. This was a time when already reduced production of food in North Korea actually plunged by almost 50%. And people did not have enough to eat, and were actually scavenging, were eating roots and tree bark and all of this. And North Korea, which has resisted all of its existence to being dependent on outside aid, suddenly asked the world, basically asked everyone and anyone, including Japan, South Korea, to come and help. So just the fact of their request indicated how grave the situation, how serious the situation was. But this collapse of production of food in North Korea was real, but it had come on not so much suddenly as gradually. And it has to do with the approach to agriculture that North Korea took in the years of before the famine, and basically maximizing production from their soils in a very unadvantageous part of the world, where actually North Korea, the territory of North Korea, had never been self-sufficient in its food production. When Korea was united, the North was fed and supplemented by food from what they called the rice bowl in the South. So they nevertheless pressed to try to grow all of their own food. And this led to actually what we call mining of the soils. Too much nutrients taken out, not enough going in. And so gradually over a number of years, there was a decline in production and harvest. Then what happened was that this agriculture was dependent heavily on chemical inputs, on fertilizers, on pesticides, on oil to run machinery, on the large collective farms, large collective fields that they were farming. And when the Soviet Union and even China backed off of its friendship deals with North Korea to supply these kinds of inputs without use of dollars, when those countries joined the international economy, North Korea was left stranded. It did not have dollar-based foreign exchange to import these inputs. And again, so the inputs to the agricultural sector plunged. This was a major factor. Now, most of the descriptions of the famine years talk about the weather, and that there was a terrible flooding and drought and flooding in 1994-95, and that's true. Of course, the same conditions, whenever we hear about these conditions in North Korea, we have to say, well, wait, this is a peninsula. So South Korea suffers similarly, but they don't go into starvation. But North Korea was on the brink, and this sort of pushed them over. And this is when, as I mentioned, the conditions of real starvation emerged, and they went out into the world against against their whole philosophy and asked for help. And so that's basically the background of that crisis.
And there's another part of your research there that does come out quite heavily throughout your research, and it will go to explain also, I suppose, why North Korea is finding itself in similar situations today. And that is the idea that it is a collectively or centrally planned, organized farming sector in some ways. And this idea that it runs from quotas and it doesn't have the sort of flexibility that it might ordinarily want.
That's right. That's a very important point. Agriculture, by its very nature, has to be locally adapted, flexible to local conditions, because soil, climate, the environment is different in the different places around a country. North Korea pursued what another scholar has called industrial-based agriculture, an industrial form of agriculture. This meant that the collective farms, and by the way, North Korea is the last place on earth, the last country on earth, to have a collective organization of agriculture, collective farms. They call them cooperatives, 협동농장, but these are actually collective on the model of the Soviet Union in the past. But these other countries have left that long ago, including Vietnam, China as well. So, but North Korea still holds to this. And so the land, the workers are organized as if this was a very large factory. It's an industrial effort to produce as much as possible from the soil. And also industrial because it relied, as I said earlier, on industry-based inputs, the chemicals, the fertilizers, the tractors and their fuel, electricity, which has to be produced and allocated around the country and to agriculture. Now, so this industrial-based agriculture was vulnerable to the conditions that emerged, as I said earlier, when these inputs failed, but also, as other countries learned, the incentive structure that the collective organization of labor, the incentive structure that it creates is not, does not contribute to the maximum effort and output-focused production. One interesting point to make is that in addition to the collective fields in North Korea, where work teams are organized in assigned a field. So, at least until recently, the field might change every year, which they were assigned to work on. In addition to that part of the collective farm, all of the farm houses, which might be 200, 300 families, were allocated a small amount of land near their house, or attached to their house, as a garden plot, and they could grow their own vegetables. They could. This was privately managed. Nothing was owned, but privately managed small plots, and these household plots or lots, as all the visitors to the area observed, were extremely productive. Not only with vegetables crawling all over the roofs and in the fences and multiple cropping, sometimes also grains, sometimes maize was being grown, at least in small amounts, etc. So the point being that obviously North Korean individual farmers know how to farm, but this knowledge, this was not being transmitted to the collective fields where they work as teams and they take direction from the central farm management on what to be planted, what seeds to use, the schedules of planting, and that all of the inputs are controlled and allocated from above, including water allocation, any machinery that's available, etc. So yes, the collective farm system that North Korea clings to is part of the problem.
And another element that you do mention quite a bit here, which is quite a fascinating element because people may think this is quite counterintuitive there, is the idea that North Korea is not one of these countries that is in any way adverse to the growth of science and technology. You mentioned the Korean Academy of Agricultural Science, and the idea that North Korea, ever since its introduction here, has been quite heavily engaged in scientific development again. But of course, it may, throughout those years, just be controlled and stymied by that same centrally controlled system.
Yes, the Academy of Agricultural Science is a group of professionals of perhaps 1,000 scientists with headquarters near Pyongyang and some offices around the country. Their job, their assignment was to maximize production within the system that I just described. And they focused a tremendous amount of research on rice technology, on rice testing rice varieties that would do best in the environment of North Korea. And in fact, they developed they developed some good varieties that were more or less matching to the conditions in North Korea. They even had exchanges that some organizations, including those I worked with, arranged with international organizations, the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, some universities in the US, other research institutes in China, to improve their research. But until recently, this was focused on making the system that I described work, and was not focused on some of the more difficult or varieties, particular environments, the multiple environments around the country. Also adapting to climate change, and to water shortages or drought. So these are newer areas of research that they've gotten into with some help from outside. So I guess the basic point being, yes, there are trained scientists in North Korea, agricultural scientists, who are working. They are interacting internationally, but their priorities were always set from above. And each year the priority has been maximize grain production primarily from using the system that is in place.
And by way of explaining, I suppose a lot of this podcast is going to go away to explaining why North Korea still finds itself food insecure despite 25 years since the famine and all the benefits that have come or potentially could have come since then. And one of the fascinating things that you mention here is the idea that the humanitarian staff that arrived in those famine years, and I suppose this is a problem that's going to be happening again today for any humanitarian organization, is that they arrived in North Korea with experience of humanitarian situations around the world. And when they arrived in North Korea, they found something that is not common. That was a state that was still very much intact. The North Korean regime was still alive and strong and functioning, and so wanted to have their finger on the dial and move the aid around themselves in many ways.
Right. So this is getting towards the use of humanitarian aid, but also I get related to agriculture as well. Yes, I myself first went to North Korea, believe it or not, in 1991, and after that, some 20 times. Maybe 15 of those related to agriculture. And in the early days, yes, certainly 91 and then 94, 95, 96, the state was extremely tight in spite of famine, etc. Humanitarian aid organizations had to work within the structure that the state dictated. They could not go out and do research on the actual conditions in the countryside. They could not collect data. The state itself had very limited data also, and it was not reliable because it comes up through a system where you are reporting on what is expected of you. So just understanding the situation was the first challenge that faced humanitarian and aid organizations in those early days. And it's continued to all along. I mean, now, because there's been a lot more, well, between 1996 up to 2012 or so, there was quite a lot of interaction with humanitarian aid organizations, with development aid organizations in North Korea. And so gradually a clearer picture emerged of what the situation was. The FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, and World Food Program, for a number of years, for some 8 or so years, had annual detailed research on the conditions in the countryside and published these every year. There were limitations on what they could collect. It was done in partnership with North Korean agencies. So there was data available, fairly reliable data through the FAO and World Food Program surveys that were done every year until 2013. And then occasionally some reach, not allowed to visit. They were always accompanied by North Korean counterparts, etc. But this was extremely helpful to understanding the situation overall. The other thing is that as aid agencies learned how to work in North Korea, a number of them that wanted to assist agriculture negotiated to be assigned several collective farms, basically to adopt these farms, to work with them over a number of years. And through that relationship, they would learn quite a bit about the local conditions. They could visit these collective farms once or twice, maybe even 3 times a year, and meet with the leaders and hear what the situation was. They could not go out and do soil sampling or interviewing or any of those. They could not even talk with the ordinary farmers. They would talk with the leaders of the farm. So there was some political aspect to some of the answers they would get. But again, over time, a fairly clear picture of the situation on those particular farms, collective farms, could be collected, and overall understanding of the situation was much clearer.
So you've painted a picture there, which I suppose for many people, they may have some questions, and I do as it was pinging through my head there. How common is the sort of scene that you're painting there? So in many people's minds, there'll be this understanding of a country that comes into some sort of food insecurity crisis, and it needs the international community to come and help it. And there is at least an assumption there that it is in such a desperate situation that it's not in a position, or therefore also not willing, to put restrictions on what that help looks like. But you painted a picture there, at least in part, of a North Korea that was absolutely desperate on one hand for international help and food aid and all the help that could possibly come, and on the other hand, were just as desperate to restrict what access happened there. So how unusual of a situation do you think this is, or what was originally found there in North Korea?
If you mean unusual internationally, I can't think of another situation. I mean, we could perhaps think more carefully that maybe there are, but the more ordinary situation is where famine or serious food shortages emerge in a weak state, a state with weak institutions. It might have a dominant leader, but the institutions are weak, and yes, are somewhat desperate, and also that the aid agencies have a freer hand to move around and through their resources become somewhat able to control the situation somewhat. But in North Korea, you're right. They, on the one hand, in 1995-96, they were so desperate that they were given the signal from the top at that time by Kim Jong-il to go forth and ask all of your contacts for help with food, with fertilizer, in particular those two things. And they went to even non-agricultural organizations that they were dealing with and said, help us. Now, this, as the situation stabilized to some extent after a few years in the 2000s, they became more strict. And also, it's a complicated history, of course. South Korea stepped in at one point after 2000 and provided massive aid as well, totally unrestricted, directly to the government. This strengthened them as well. They began to back off of this sort of open-ended request for aid to humanitarian aid organizations and restricted the access by non-government organizations to only a very few. And after 2012, they told all aid organizations, all non-government aid organizations, to leave the country. So they basically reclaimed their control over the system and over the aid organizations they were dealing with. Today, there are UN organizations and others that the other non-government organizations can visit, but they do not have residence there.
And that's an interesting point there, because you mentioned in the early 2000s how South Korea suddenly had a huge amount of access inside North Korea. But it was also the case that as the North Korean state was intact, it also had its political, I suppose, motivations very much intact too. And you mentioned in your methodology for some of your work here that in those early years of the 1990s and the famine there, despite needing as much international aid and desiring as much as possible, there were restrictions placed on two particular countries. That was South Korea and America. And I can only assume that is because I'm assuming, I'm not sure how you see this, but perhaps presented more of a political risk than other countries.
Oh, definitely. So their relationship with South Korea, as you can see today, is very difficult one. On the one hand, they know that there's this extremely wealthy, almost first world country right next to them, which claims to, as they both do, to be the government of all Korea. So on the one hand, how do you tap that without letting them get close enough to basically overwhelm you? I mean, that's always been, so that there are periods of engagement followed by periods of restriction. South Koreans, for the most part, were never allowed even the freedom of that NGOs and governments from other countries did in, say, visiting rural sites and having access to the areas that they were wanting to assist. The North always pressed South Korea to just give their aid directly to the government of North Korea and let it allocate it. And for the most part, South Korea followed that model. As for United States, yes, they were always in this, they're in a state of war with the United States. And there was simultaneous negotiations going on over the nuclear issue all through this period up to today, of course. And so it was a fraught relationship. American NGOs, they tested them very carefully. They investigated them to see which might be more trustworthy, and then would allow limited basis access to, in this case, rural areas. As I said, two organizations based in the United States that I worked with did adopt collective farms to work on. This was the Quakers, the American Friends Service Committee, and World Vision International. Not World Vision South Korea, but World Vision International. So they were allowed access to rural areas because for the first one, the American Friends, they had they had developed a relationship with North Korea, dialogue, pre-famine, for perhaps 20 years before the famine, and were highly trusted. And they worked very, very carefully and without publicity. The World Vision came in with perhaps, among the organizations with the largest amount of aid at that time. And certainly this was persuasive to the North Koreans. But also they worked very, very carefully and were able to work then at local level. But, one important point is that U.S.-based or South Korean-based NGOs could not open offices in North Korea, whereas those based in the European Union were allowed to have separate local offices in Korea to develop and monitor their programs. That was a major division.
So you mentioned something quite interesting, and you mentioned it twice now, the idea that there was those adoption of farms in North Korea. So what is the underlying theory behind that? For me, as a layperson, when it comes to agricultural academia, etc., it just sounds like a very small, almost parochial way to go about these things. So why was that focus there? Was it simply because they didn't have access elsewhere and this was something they could do? Or was it more of a chance to trial and error something, the idea that we can start something on this farm and then spread it out across the country? And if that latter, how successful was the spread from there out?
Well, let me describe how this would happen. In my own experience, and I know it was common for most of the organizations that were attempting to assist North Korea at the time, first North Korea would ask, just send us food and send us fertilizer, and we will take care of it. You don't have to see anything, just believe us. The situation is terrible. If you want to help, this is what you should do. Well, after doing that for 1 or 2 years, the agency said, we cannot any longer raise money to do this. We need to get at the causes of the problem. And so to do this, we really need to see the situation. Also, we need to be able to monitor the use of our contributions in order to report to our donors and continue to raise money. So there was a tension around this, a lot of discussion and negotiation with the authorities in the North, between the NGOs and the authorities. And so this led to the idea that the NGOs proposed to, if you would just let us see the situation on the ground and what the problem is, this would allow us to raise more resources and to calibrate our assistance to the actual situation. So after a lot of negotiation, they said, okay, we'll we'll take you out and let you, and of course they had to go through their system and decide, well, what farms can we show them? And eventually, though, they would take you out to see the situation to visit a collective farm. So out of that process, then discussing this local situation with at least leaders at the local level, a plan could be developed for supporting that particular collective farm. Now, and it's not small. I mean, you're talking about hundreds of families and 5,000 hectares of land. So, I mean, this is as much as most NGOs could manage would be, several of these, not the whole country. But this was the alternative to just dumping fertilizer at the top or food at the top and letting the state, through its own priorities, let it trickle down. That was not sustainable for the aid organizations. So this compromise, sort of giving them windows on the society at the local level, letting them focus on a particular local situation and help that situation as much as possible.
And those adopted farms, how free from influence from the government were they? Because there's a moment in some of your research here which is almost comical if it wasn't for the tragedy that was going on around it. And that was this moment that at one of these adopted farms, these the people, the countries that have adopted these farms and their representatives are meeting with the farm managers. And these farm managers are accompanied by central authority figures at the time. And there's a moment where they turn up for one of these visits and they ask for trucks, which are not needed on the farm at the time. And the second request is for a pair of emus, those great big flightless birds from Australia. The idea that, and I suppose the claim was, we need a male and a female so we can breed them for meat.
Yeah. This was one of the most tragically comical situations. I myself experienced that. I'm reporting my experience. When we went out to the farms, say 2 or 3 times a year, we would visit these farms. You would have meetings in Pyongyang first. Then you would be accompanied by your minder, who was not an agriculturalist, an interpreter, at least those two. Sometimes one other specialist, and go out to the farm. And I would be accompanied by an agriculturalist from our organization who knew more than I did about actual crop production and all. And as I mentioned earlier, you could not go out just as we arrived. Whenever you arrived at a farm, you would always, those who had accompanied you from Pyongyang would huddle with the local farm leaders, which would be the farm manager. This is collective farm manager, someone supervising a major factory-style production. And this was almost always a woman. That's interesting. And the farm party leader, who was almost, and I think always, a man. And so these would be the two main people that you would meet with. Sometimes they would bring in another team leader or someone from the farm. So, but they would huddle first with the people from Pyongyang, and then you would go into a meeting and get this information. And it was just obvious that Pyongyang had established certain priorities, maybe even nationally. I mean, you can understand tractors, right? Tractors, trucks, they wanted to get back to mechanization. And of course, but that raised many questions of maintenance and parts and fuel, of course. So we always sort of resisted that. At one point, we gave some trucks for transportation. That's another story. But then after that, then comes maybe a little whispering, and then yes, we forgot. We wanted to ask you for these emu birds. And I'm sure that the farm leaders there had never heard of emu birds. But anyway, I would have thought this is interesting. It became more transparent when we would visit, in some cases, up to 6 collective farms in one of the visits to the country. And if at every one of them, the local farm leader had this brainstorm of emu birds, you knew this was not coming from the farm. So it's coming from the top. Sometimes we would be told that the leader himself had become convinced that this was the solution to the meat production problem. He did become convinced on goats and announced this major program nationwide with goats, which led to some good results. Somehow he or someone near him had come up with the solution that emu birds would do the trick. I never saw any, so I think that pretty much died quickly. But let me tell you another short story if I can.
Yes, of course.
Okay. This has to do with communication. I speak basic Korean. I was in the Peace Corps in South Korea. I lived on farm in South Korea, etc. And I speak basic Korean. In fact, this was an exemption that they even allowed me to work in North Korea because they didn't want people who spoke the language. Again, a major difference from any other country you would work in, right? I mean, most countries would welcome, oh my gosh, you speak our language. This is great. You can understand us better. You can talk to people. No, in North Korea, they actually prevented people from coming who spoke the language. Now, there were exceptions, and I was an exception. Now, I won't try to guess why, but they would always caution me about it. And there was, in one case, we're sitting with a farm manager and leader, and I'm hearing the Korean, and the interpreter, then I wait, and the interpreter interprets it to me. So one advantage was I could check, is he really saying what they're saying? But then one time, one of the farm managers, a woman, first of all, I asked a very sensitive question after getting all the farm information. We were trying to understand the structure, the incentive structure, etc. And I asked a question related to the allocation of the harvest, because this is collective farm, they harvest, and then it's divided up to various uses, and then some goes to the workers based on their work points, etc. But a large amount, of course, goes to the state, and the farm is paid in set price set by the state, which is not always advantageous. So I just asked this year, how much did you, I don't know if I said required, how much did you sell to the state of your production that you just told me? The woman paused and looked at the person from Pyongyang and said in Korean, how do I answer this idiot? It's like, no, maybe not idiot, but 이 질문에 어떻게 대답할까?
Okay.
Like this is obviously a political question. And so they basically said, well, we can't answer that, or we don't know the answer to that. But again, you see the dynamic there between the local and the national, the state representative is the ultimate authority on how to interact with the foreigners.
So on that same kind of topic there, and this idea of your personal interaction and that break between the personal and the broader national concern, there is another quite candid moment that you mentioned in your research here, where you're speaking to a senior official in the Ministry of Agriculture, and he or she whispers to you and says, "We have destroyed our soils," they say. So I suppose my question on this one is, how much did the average person that you interacted with understand the real challenges facing their agricultural sector, or was it always a heavily politicized, I suppose, discussion about what had went wrong and what the solution should be, or was there a very realistic kind of understanding of the failures of the North Korean farming system?
Yeah, that's hard to say, because the authorities that we would meet with in Pyongyang, the Ministry of Agriculture, the Academy of Agricultural Science, the political minders, they all kept to the same line. Their task was to get as much assistance as possible from us. And to what extent they understood, they were not agriculturalists. Minister of Agriculture was agricultural, but they had not actually farm the soil, I suspect. So they were operating within a system that they could not change. And it's in that system, is what I called an almost industrial style agriculture, that they had to maximize production or else. So, they kept to the line. There were very few times where I saw sort of behind the curtain. The one that you describe, the paper you read, it's the first time I've mentioned this. It's now, 20, how many years? 20 years later, So I'm suspecting this guy is not in the same position if he is still with us in this world. So I went ahead and, I don't think they can trace that, but went ahead and mentioned it. He had been on a study trip abroad. So some organizations, including those I worked with, arranged for agriculturalists at the national level to visit U.S. universities, sometimes U.S. farms, China, other places, to get an idea of what they might adopt and improve their research, improve their practices. So he had come back from one of those and had probably not only seen a lot, but discussed a lot with others. And I guess that's why, and an element of trust had built up, and that's why he could do that. I can't recall, I'd have to check my documents, but I'm not sure how much longer he was in that position.
You do mention there, and we're speaking a lot about the political element here. And this is, you mentioned the idea that the leader, who of course at the time was Kim Jong-il, new leader at the time, taking over from his father, once a directive came from the leadership, it was suddenly adopted on a national scale, whereby smaller initiatives just simply would fail if it didn't have that sort of pressure. So I might get you to talk through two things that it seemed like the aid agencies at the time were putting forward a lot of recommendations, and yet two of them that got picked up was the idea that you should increase the production of potatoes, and the other thing that you mentioned previously was the production of goats. So I might get you to talk us through these two particular programs. Why were they so necessary, and just how much more successful were they across the country, simply because they had, I suppose, favor from the upper echelons of the leadership?
Well, first of all, both of those cases, potatoes and goats, became a high priority for those in charge of agriculture. And they would then send these directives down through the system to the collective farms. And suddenly every collective farm would be planting potatoes. Of course, they had then set up a system for seed potatoes and all. Now, potatoes were not entirely new. Another is barley as a spring crop. These crops had been grown in the past in North Korea, but had declined greatly as the all-out focus basically in the 1980s even was on maximizing grain production. But anyway, they brought back barley, they brought back potatoes basically at the command of the leader, and so everyone had to fall in line and follow that. Whether your local area was really suitable for those crops, you had to do something. They also then turned to the aid providers and said, help us with this, because here you want to do something new. This has now got the green light, so you can come in and help a lot with this. Potatoes got a lot of help from a U.S. NGO consortium, which we don't have time to go into and all the politics of that, but that went on for a couple of years. Barley, well, it was not that difficult, but it also got a lot of help. So yes, there was a increase in production in both these crops, which probably helped a lot in the lean season before the rice harvest during the early summer and summer months. They would have to be harvested before the rice transplanting, but this was the lean season. So they did help a lot. Now, I haven't been there in a while, but I have read that in both cases, in potatoes in particular, even though it was fairly successful, they have declined production in recent years. And again, these are agricultural issues which are a little difficult in a short time to explain, but potatoes turned out, of course, to be competing for nutrients in the soil with the rice crop that would follow them after you harvested the potatoes. So again, it comes back to the soils themselves and how much they could produce, either of rice or any other crop. So yes, they played a role in helping during some very difficult time, and it was the leader's direction that worked. But still, the fundamental problem, which I hope I can mention before we end, in my view, shall I go ahead?
Yes, let's get into it, absolutely.
Okay. Fundamental problem is, as I say in the paper you read, and to put it bluntly, North Korea, in my view, should not grow all of its own food. It should not maximize to the extent of draining the soils the production of grain. Like almost every other country, it should produce what the local environment can sustain, while at the same time importing from more favored countries the food it needs to supplement local production.
So can I just ask a question on that, just to clarify it for people listening here? That sounds like a message that a modern audience doesn't want to hear. The idea that I suppose it's a fresh trend these days that we should all seek our own food, our own national food security. The idea that we should all pursue our own aims in this and we should be self-sufficient in this. And you do mention through your research, though I didn't mention it yet, the idea that aid agencies coming into North Korea often simply accepted the fact that this was going to be a self-sufficient, self-reliant society. So, it seems almost counterintuitive. So I might get you to open that up as much as possible here. Yeah.
Well, many aid agencies questioned this, but it was quickly clear that it wasn't an option if they were going to engage with North Korea and try to address the problem, at least of human suffering. It was not an immediate possibility. Because it's a political decision of how to use your foreign exchange, how to make priorities. Also, it had to do with the whole restructuring of the industrial base for creating exportable products to earn foreign exchange with which to buy the things they need, which again, almost every country in the world does. So I'm not sure I caught the gist of your question, but even if outsiders, let me mention this. If you read the annual FAO and World Food Program reports, as they went on in years, they more and more hinted at this issue, but these are reports that had to be approved by the North Korean authorities as well. But they would hint at these issues, but never directly state the problem clearly, that they would talk about the soils being mined. The soils have to be really regenerated. You cannot plant on slopes and you're going to have more flooding, etc. All of these things were done to maximize production. They would cite all these problems, but they would stop short of saying, just back off of this maximum output approach. My main point is that the outside aid givers, and particularly, of course, the UN agencies, FAO and World Food Program, are pressing the system to its maximum rather than what should be appropriate agricultural production domestically. Nevertheless, they knew politically it was not a message that the government wanted to hear or would hear, or even would allow them to put in as a recommendation in their reports. So this is a dilemma. My recommendation, though, is that this, in spite of this resistance, given that the aid agencies are still 25 years later in the same situation, they should raise this much more and a more aggressive way to move towards sort of resilient agriculture rather than maximum production agriculture. Now, the problem is this means reorganization of the economy, and it means a removal of sanctions so that North Korea can export what it has to export, increase its production of exportable products in order to gain foreign exchange to purchase the food to supplement local production. So this is a major issue, but I think it should frame the approach that aid agencies in the future use. They should know if they're going to press for maximum production of food in North Korea, that there will be this continuation of shortages for year after year.
As we wind this down with a few last questions, there's one part of this equation that we haven't mentioned quite enough, I suppose, and that is one of the idea of agricultural infrastructure. And you mentioned some statistics throughout your research here. That is the idea that despite the best agricultural practices, a huge amount of North Korean production is lost in delays from transport into the field to the threshing facility, and then from the threshing facility to the warehouses, etc. And the infrastructure is just not there, at least not yet, to as opposed to maximize the production as much as would be desired.
That's right. This problem of what we call post-harvest losses has been evident from the beginning of when aid agencies came in. And the problem is that after, let's just take rice, for example, when it's harvested by hand. It's laid in the fields. It's just dropped in the fields to dry somewhat. If it rains, it gets wet. Transporting it to the threshed central, there may be in a collective farm 4 or 5 threshing floors with machinery, but they're still remote from the fields. They were carried by hand to these places, and so labor has to be allocated for that. And all in that process, there are losses in the quality of the grain, even number of grains. Okay, then it's threshed, but those machines themselves are old and not well maintained, and also, so they do not do a good job of threshing. A lot is lost in that process. And then set aside to wait for trucks, which are extremely limited in number, and also fuel is limited, to take these to warehouses for central storing. And all of that process, through a research project, the FAO determined that 15 to 16% of the harvest is lost. They compare that to South Korea, where the comparable figure might be 4 or 5%, or even less. So one of my recommendations in this recent paper is that this be targeted as a high priority. Now, how would you solve that? Actually, FAO did a concrete study that can be found online about the issue I just described and how to approach it. The problem is, again, you go back to in a collective system with the threshing floor far away, central warehouses far away, you're relying on fuel and transportation to move this product harvest quickly and also to replace those old machinery, the threshing machinery, with modern machinery that can do a much more efficient job, et cetera, et cetera. So you're talking again about the lack of industrial capacity of North Korea. And so so agriculture, I guess a major point is that agriculture worldwide, but especially in North Korea, is dependent on the industrial sector. It's dependent on it for fuel, it's dependent on it for chemical inputs, and transportation, machinery, production, all of that. It's dependent on producing exportable material to supplement local production with foreign exchange, etc. So the approach should be in this comprehensive way, not in the piece by piece, how to grow a little more of this or a little more of that. You have to back up and see the whole picture, and then design a program together with the North Koreans. If not, even if it's not possible to address all of the factors immediately, at least to bring them into consideration and know the limitations of what you can do at the moment.
So we've been piecing together slowly throughout this interview some of your core recommendations and what we should do for North Korea. And one of them, clearly, as you mentioned, there is this idea of something more resilient form of farming, and the idea of not milking as much as you can out of the land. And just an example for many listeners is something that you mentioned quite a lot in your research, which is a tremendous problem in North Korea, and that is the challenge of deforestation. And North Korea is a country that has got huge deforestation challenges. And there is a pressure that was at least coming apart from some of the aid agencies to reforest the country at the time. So I might get to touch on that briefly, the importance of that and some of the challenges involved.
Yeah. Well, for someone who has lived in South Korea, yourself, myself, we can see the forest cover in South Korea is extremely impressive. And yet, if you had been there in 1950s, 60s, you would have seen almost, bald hills throughout South Korea. So South Korea is an example of, worldwide, of an example of successful reforestation. And again, why both North and South Korea, why were they the hills denuded of cover? Because farm families, and both were basically farm agricultural societies before the Korean War, they were dependent on the forests for fuel, for heating their homes, for cooking their food. They also grew additional crops in the mountains and in the hills, and so they cut forests in both parts of the country. South Korea, I was there when they moved away from using firewood and introduced a coal-based product, the yuntan. This is the to fuel for cooking and heating in all of the South Korean rural and urban homes. And this quickly cut the need for firewood, and then based on that, they could go ahead with reforestation. North Korea, on the other hand, the 1/3 or more of the population that lives in rural areas on these collective farms are still using wood for their heat and for their cooking. And they still go to the hills and cut even saplings and whatever's available nearby for these purposes. So they have not switched, they have not changed out of that. Now, why? Because the orders did not come out. It was somehow not communicated to the leadership that this should be a priority. So it does not become a priority. In North Korea, you still have cutting of firewood. Now, on top of that, as food supply declined, there was a move to start doing farming on steep slopes, on hillsides. So again, more trees were cut since early 1990s, even late 1980s, to grow food on hillsides, both collectively and, in this case, individually. Farmers went in and opened small plots to grow more food for themselves. These later on, it seems, were also collectivized. So they have this continual deforestation process is going on. So you come in with reforestation, the first thing is to stop deforestation. And how you do that is you have to change that system in some way. Now, there have been pilot projects and South Korea has offered to help. The reason this is so important is that it's connected to agriculture. It's the denuded hillsides, when the rains come, even ordinary rains in North Korea, much less typhoons and such, there's nothing to hold the soil until it slips right down into both fields and into stream beds. Stream beds then are raised, and so the flooding, the water level is raised, water goes into the fields, you have flooding. So this is just a continual cycle the solution has to begin with stopping deforestation. That's the overview that I can give.
So we've been as I mentioned just before, with a lot of recommendations that you put through your research here, and we touched on them all briefly. And one that you mentioned at the very start here, and I suppose this is a decent way to end the interview on as well, is the idea of the incentive structure in North Korea and the challenges that are presented for anyone in the world when the right incentives are not there. Now, there's this moment in 2012 that everyone spoke about. There was a reformation of sorts in the farming sector, and you mentioned in your research, though, of course, some of these reforms were enacted. They, in some cases, were uneven and often were reversed, and that hasn't come through in the way that might be hoped. And I suppose this leads into my big question here towards the end here. And you mentioned this as a final paragraph in the paper of yours I have in front of me. And that is the idea that you say some of these steps will be resisted by the North Korean authorities and will require political decisions at the highest level. And I wonder how you see the situation today, because all these changes that we've been talking about and all the situation that we've been going through does in many ways hinge on the attitudes and the way the North Korean authorities, the higher ups, see this kind of change inside their country and see aid agencies.
So the question you've asked really goes to the heart of the matter, and that is, why does North Korea hold on to this system of agriculture, collective agriculture, that is not producing the results it expects? And I think ultimately this is a political issue, that whereas there has been some relaxation in other parts of the economy in North Korea, in urban areas, with the opening of markets and the allowing of some free enterprise of various sorts, the rural areas have basically, the farms have been sort of frozen in time, with some adjustments that you mentioned, which I can explain. But overall, though, in spite of the example of China in moving towards what they call the family household, or the household farming approach, where at least each household was allocated, it's not private land, at least land that they could farm for 20 years, and so put all their effort into. That example has been there all along, and yet they have not adopted it. There are various theories about this, but one that's somewhat convincing is that this is a form of social control. Those on the collective farms in North Korea, they are assigned there. Their fathers and their grandfathers were farmers there. They cannot leave. They cannot move to a city and do something else. They are there. They are assigned there. This already creates an incentive problem, I think. It's a form of control. I think North Korea is not yet ready. It's also perhaps not ready for a farming system where everyone makes their own decisions and introduces a form of freedom of maneuver that they are not ready for. A second possibility, this is more controversial, I guess, as I did mention in somewhere in my paper, is the way the farms are organized now gives control of the food supply, which is collected from the farms, the collective farms, to those in authority, might include the military as well. The military has the first share of the national production to make sure it's provided. The elites who need to be fed, the party, etc. So this goes back to the very delicate balance right now in North Korea, that somehow keeping it alive, where, yeah, there are many irrational things, and I think the agricultural sector is perhaps the most irrational, and yet it's part of a system and a structure that is keeping those in power in place and keeping them safe. They're not ready for the kind of social mobility, local decision making that changes in this major part of the economy would bring. That's a theory, but it's somewhat convincing to me.
It is also a great thoughtful note to leave the interview on. Now, throughout the interview, there's many segues that we could have taken, as the listeners will be aware of, and we just didn't have time, of course. But below the podcast, I'm going to link a number of Ed's articles. I do encourage you to go and read as much as possible. I'm going to link his biography and places you can read further his research. It absolutely fascinating stuff, and much, much deeper than the chances we had today to actually get into it. So please go and read it all for yourself. You won't be disappointed. On that, Edward Reed, thanks for coming on the Career Now podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's been very interesting. I hope that I've been able to articulate to some extent the complicated issues we talked about.